Prologue. The discovery of the ledger. In the dim and dust-laden silence of the Bodleian Library sub-basement, amidst a collection of forgotten county histories and crumbling ecclesiastical surveys, I chanced upon a small, hidebound ledger. It was tucked behind a folio of Suffolk marriage records, its leather cover cracked and brittle, its pages foxed with age and smelling profoundly of neglect and decay. The script within was a precise, copperplate hand, though in places it degenerated into a frantic, sprawling scrawl, as if the author's composure had been quite overthrown by the events he chronicled. The account is attributed to one Reverend Alban Cuthbert, formerly of the parish of Blackmere, a village which, upon consulting the most exhaustive of maps, appears to have been excised from all but the oldest surveys. It is a tale so singularly dreadful, so at odds with the rational spirit of our modern age, that I present it with no small measure of trepidation. I have endeavored to preserve the Reverend's words, and his peculiar style, believing that to alter them would be to do a grave disservice to whatever strange truth they may contain. Let the reader approach with caution, and judge for themselves whether this is the product of a fevered mind, a sinister hoax, or a glimpse into a realm of darkness that propriety and science have long since taught us to disregard. Chapter 1. The New Incumbent. It was in the autumn of 1837, a year marked by the accession of our young queen, that I first took up the living in the village of Blackmere. The circumstances of my appointment were themselves somewhat irregular. The previous incumbent, a Mr. Withers, had vanished from his vicarage some 6 months prior, leaving no word nor trace behind him. The bishop, a pragmatic man not given to fanciful speculation, attributed the disappearance to a sudden crisis of faith or a secret shame, and dispatched me with instructions to steady the flock and restore order to the parish. The journey from Ipswich was a dreary one. A relentless drizzle fell from a sky the color of tarnished pewter, and the hired trap navigated roads that had been churned into a foul, sucking morass of mud. The countryside through which we passed was flat and melancholic, dominated by vast, soggy fens and skeletal groves of alder and willow. The very air seemed thick with moisture and a profound silence, broken only by the weary plod of the horses' hooves and the dismal croaking of unseen marshfowl. Blackmere, when it at last hove into view, did little to lift my spirits. It was a mean collection of perhaps 36 cottages huddled around a crooked green, all built of the same dark, rough-hewn timber and daub, their roofs sagging under the weight of centuries of damp thatch. The village seemed to cower beneath the elements, as if perpetually braced against some impending blow. At its northern edge stood my new charge, the church of St. Guthlac. It was a squat, Norman structure, its stonework stained black with lichen and age, its crenellated tower leaning at a disconcerting angle. Adjacent to it stood the vicarage, a gaunt and cheerless house of similar antiquity, its windows like sightless eyes staring out over the desolate graveyard. The villagers I initially encountered were a dour, taciturn breed. Men tipped their hats and women offered curtsies, but their eyes held no warmth, only a kind of weary suspicion. They spoke in the broad, flat accents of the fens, their words few and measured. I attributed their reserve to the natural circumspection of country folk towards a new stranger, and to the scandal of my predecessor's disappearance. I was greeted at the vicarage by Mrs. Rigby, the housekeeper, a woman of severe aspect and few words, who had stayed on to maintain the place. She was a widow, her face a web of lines etched by hardship and the relentless fenland wind. "The house is sound, Reverend," she said, taking my sodden greatcoat, "though it has its damp. And its noises." "All old houses speak to us, Mrs. Rigby," I replied with a cheerfulness I did not feel. "It is merely the settling of timbers." She fixed me with a look that was not quite insolent, but carried a weight of profound knowing. "Aye, sir. Settling." That first night, as the wind moaned about the eaves and the rain lashed the windows, I endeavored to make myself at home in the study. Mr. Withers's effects had been largely cleared away, but a sense of his presence lingered, a faint odor of pipe smoke and anxiety. It was then that I discovered the first hint of the peculiar malaise that seemed to grip Blackmere. In the bottom drawer of the desk, tucked beneath a stack of sermon paper, I found a small, clumsily carved doll. It was fashioned from bog oak, its features crude, but its most striking aspect was its eyes, 2 chips of jet-black glass that seemed to absorb the lamplight, giving the thing a vacant, yet deeply unsettling, stare. With a shudder of distaste, I cast it into the fire, watching as the flames consumed it. I told myself it was merely a child's forgotten toy, but the image of those black, depthless eyes lingered long after the doll had turned to ash. Chapter 2: The Children of the Mere. My duties began in earnest the following Sunday. The congregation was small, their hymns sung with a listless apathy that I was determined to overcome. They were a hardy people, their faces weathered and lined, but I observed a common trait, a faint, perpetual anxiety that seemed to dwell just behind their eyes. They listened to my sermon on Christian fortitude with polite indifference, and filed out with a quiet haste I found curious. It was as I stood at the church door, bidding them farewell, that I saw them for the first time. A group of 3 children, separate from the others, standing motionless at the edge of the churchyard where the land began to slope down towards the vast, mist-shrouded mere that gave the village its name. They were perhaps between 8 and 12 years of age, dressed in the rough, homespun clothes of the peasantry, but unnaturally clean and neat. It was not their attire, however, that arrested my attention. They were perfectly still, their arms hanging limp at their sides. And they were watching me. Not with the shy curiosity of village children, but with a flat, unwavering intensity. Even from a distance of 20 yards, I could see their eyes. They were entirely black. Not dark brown, but a solid, glossy, pitch black, like the eyes of the doll I had burned. Devoid of white, devoid of spark, devoid of any human light whatsoever. A coldness that had nothing to do with the fenland damp seized my vitals. I made to approach them, to offer a Christian greeting, but the moment I took a step in their direction, they turned in perfect unison and melted away into the churchyard's dripping yews, silent as ghosts. Who were those children? I asked Mrs. Rigby upon returning to the vicarage. The ones by the mere wall. Their eyes. Mrs. Rigby, who was laying the table for supper, went very still. Her knuckles whitened on the handle of the soup tureen. "You do well to pay them no mind, Reverend," she said, her voice low and tight. "But, my good woman, if they are in need of spiritual guidance, or if there is some congenital affliction—" "They are not," she interrupted, a breach of decorum so stark it shocked me into silence. She composed herself with visible effort. "They are the Meldon children. Their family keeps to themselves. Out by the mere. They are not like other children. It is best not to look at them, not to acknowledge them." She would say no more on the subject, and the rest of the meal passed in a strained silence. Her words, however, had the opposite of their intended effect. My curiosity, and a growing sense of disquiet, were now thoroughly piqued. In the days that followed, I made discreet inquiries. With the parish clerk, a jovial man named Miller, I broached the subject of the Meldons while reviewing the parish register. "Ah, the Meldons," he said, his usual bonhomie fading. He ran a finger inside his collar. "Old family. Very old. Keep to their own ways out there on the spit of land in the mere. Don't trouble nobody, and nobody troubles them." The register told a strange story. The name Meldon appeared with a curious frequency, but the entries were often irregular. Baptisms were recorded months, sometimes years, after the birth. There were no records of the black-eyed children I had seen, no baptisms, no births. When I pointed this out, Miller shifted uncomfortably. "Old Tam Meldon, the patriarch, he don't hold much with church. Has his own ways. The mother, well, she was from away. A foreign sort. Some say a gypsy, though others whisper darker things. The children, they just are." He closed the heavy book with a definitive thud. "Best to leave it be, Reverend. Some roots go too deep into the old mud to be pulled up." My next port of call was the village schoolmistress, a Miss Beatrice Crow, a woman of gentle disposition and keen intelligence. At the mention of the Meldon children, her face paled. "They do not attend the school," she said, folding her hands tightly in her lap. "They never have. Once, years ago, when I first came here, I went out to the Meldon cottage. I believed it my Christian duty to offer learning to all the village's young souls. Old Tam met me at the door. He did not speak, merely stared until I was forced to retreat. But from the shadows behind him, I saw them. 3 small figures, watching me with those eyes. She shuddered. It is said, Reverend, that they are not born but made. That the mere, which has taken so many fishermen, travelers, even the previous vicar, sometimes gives something back. Something that looks like a child, but is hollow inside. A vessel for the cold water and the older things that sleep in the deep mud. I left her, more disturbed than ever. Superstition, I told myself. The ignorant fears of uneducated minds. Yet, the image of those perfectly black, expressionless eyes would not leave me. It was a seed of dread, and in the fertile soil of Blackmere's isolation, it began to sprout. Chapter 3. The Weight of the Past. The atmosphere of Blackmere began to work upon my nerves. The silence was not mere absence of sound. It was a presence, a heavy blanket that smothered the world. The mists that rose from the mere each evening did not dissipate with the dawn but seemed to linger, leaching the color from the landscape and leaving everything in a perpetual state of twilight. The villagers' reticence hardened into something more pronounced, a deliberate avoidance. Where once I had received nods, I now found averted gazes and hastily closed doors. I took to walking the lanes in the afternoon, a futile attempt to shake off the creeping sense of oppression. It was on one such walk that I encountered Elias Grote, the oldest man in the parish, a relic who claimed to remember the Napoleonic Wars. He was sitting on a stump outside his tumble-down cottage, whittling a piece of wood with a shaking hand. "Good afternoon, Mr. Grote," I said. He squinted up at me, his own eyes milky with cataracts. "Reverend, you're still here then?" "I am. I intend to remain." So did the others." He returned to his whittling. The shape in his hand was disturbingly familiar, a small, crude figure. "The others?" I pressed. "Vicars. This parish it eats Mr. Withers, afore he went, he were seen out by the mere. Talking to the water, he was. And the children were there. Watching." Grote's voice dropped to a whisper, a dry rustle of leaves. "This place is old, Reverend. Older than the church. The water and the mud, they remember. They get hungry. Sometimes they send their servants up to look around." "Their servants?" I asked, my mouth gone dry. He held up the figure he was carving. It was another doll, this one with 2 chips of dark peat for eyes. The children with the black eyes. They're the watchers for the deep. They come into a house and they just stand and stare. And where they look, things wither. Livestock sickens. Milk sours in the churn. And folk fade away. The joy leaves, then the health, then the will to live. Old Nan Pringle, she let one in for a crust of bread. She was dead within the month. Just gave up. This was the fulsome horror of peasant superstition, the kind of talk I had been trained to dismiss. Yet here, in the gathering dusk, with the mist fingering its way through the hedgerows, it felt less like a fancy and more like a folk memory of something unspeakable. "And Mr. Withers?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "Did he let them in?" Grote looked at me, and for a moment his milky eyes seemed to clear, filled with a terrible pity. He were a learned man. Didn't believe. Thought he could reason with them. He went out to the Meldon cottage to confront old Tam. They say he took his prayer book and his cross. The old man shook his head slowly. "The mere don't care for prayers, Reverend. The old things sleepin' in the mud, they were old before ever a Christ walked the earth." He would say no more. I returned to the vicarage, my mind a tumult of fear and reason warring for dominance. That night, the noises of the house were different. No longer the harmless settling of timbers, but something more purposeful. A soft, dragging step in the corridor outside my room. A faint, wet sound, like mud bubbling. And once, a breath against the door, a long, drawn-out sigh that smelled of stagnant water and decay. I rose from my bed, my heart hammering against my ribs, and flung open the door. The corridor was empty. But on the floorboards, leading away towards the stairs, was a trail of damp, earthy footprints, far too small to belong to an adult. Chapter 4. The Invitation. The following Sunday, my sermon was a disaster. My concentration was shattered, my thoughts returning incessantly to Grote's words and the small, wet footprints. The congregation seemed to sense my distraction, their own unease palpable in the cold air of the church. As they departed, I saw the Meldon children again. They were closer this time, standing just inside the lich gate. 3 of them. Motionless. Watching. This time, I did not look away. A strange resolve hardened within me. This was my parish. These were souls, however blighted, under my care. This foolishness, this darkness, would end. I would go to the source. I sought out Mrs. Rigby. I intend to visit the Meldon family this afternoon. To pay a pastoral call. The color drained from her face. Sir, I beg you do not. I must. It is my duty. Then you go to your doom, she whispered and fled the room. Undeterred, I set out along the mere path in the late afternoon. The way was treacherous, a narrow track of sucking mud that wound through stands of reed and grey alder. The air grew colder, and the silence deepened, until the only sound was the squelch of my own boots and the occasional plop of something from the dark, still waters to my right. The mere was a sheet of leaden glass, reflecting the brooding sky. It felt watchful. After a mile, I came upon the cottage. It was a wretched hovel, built partly of stone and partly of piled turf, its roof sagging almost to the ground. It looked less like a dwelling and more like a part of the landscape, a tumor of earth and rot. No smoke rose from its chimney. No sign of life stirred about it. I knocked on the rough wooden door, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. It was opened by a man who could only be old Tam Meldon. He was tall and gaunt, dressed in clothes that seemed to be made of cured hides and sackcloth. His face was a mask of leathery wrinkles, but his eyes were sharp and bright, and they were a normal, pale blue. This small normality was more shocking than anything else. Reverend, he said. His voice was like the grating of 2 stones together. He did not seem surprised to see me. Mr. Meldon, I am the new vicar. I wish to introduce myself and see if your family has need of anything. A faint, cruel smile touched his lips. We have all we need. He did not invite me in, but he stepped aside, a clear gesture of entry. A wave of foul air washed out from the interior, the smell of damp earth, of rotting fish, of something profoundly unclean. I crossed the threshold. The interior was a single room, dark and bare. A cold hearth held a pile of grey ash. In the corner, a woman, presumably Mrs. Meldon, huddled under a blanket, her back to me. She did not move. And standing in the center of the room, in a neat row, were the children. Up close, the effect of their eyes was paralyzing. The blackness was absolute, a void that offered no reflection, no intelligence, no soul. They simply stood, 3 small figures, and stared at me. I felt a physical sensation, a cold pressure against my skin, as if their gaze had weight and substance. I found I could not look away. The urge to flee, to scream, was almost overwhelming, but my limbs felt leaden, locked in place. My children, old Tam said, and there was a hideous pride in his voice. They do not attend church, I managed to stammer, forcing the words out against the oppressive silence. They have their own communion, he replied. I became aware of a sound, a faint, soft dripping. I looked down. Water was welling up from between the packed earth of the floorboards, pooling around the children's bare feet. But they did not seem to notice. Their black eyes remained fixed on me. What are they? I breathed, my theological training, my rationality, crumbling to dust in the face of this palpable wrongness. Old Tam moved closer to me, his breath a foul miasma. The mere is deep, Reverend. And old. It gives and it takes. It took my first 3. My bonny, bright-eyed bairns. Dragged them down into the peat. And it gave me these back. They are dutiful. They obey their father. And they honor the old ones in the mud. I understood then. This was no congenital defect. This was something else. Something pagan and vile. A transaction. A bargain with the swamp. The woman in the corner began to rock back and forth, a low, hopeless moaning coming from her. It was the sound of a soul in perpetual torment. You must leave, I said, finding a shred of authority from somewhere. "This is not right. This is an abomination before God." Old Tam's smile vanished. "Your God holds no sway here. This is an older place. You should not have come. You have been seen. Properly seen. And now they know you." He looked at the children and then back at me. "You should go now. Before the mist comes down fully. It's easy to get lost on the mere path in the mist." The dismissal was final. I stumbled backwards out of the cottage, my heart pounding with a pure, animal terror. I half ran, half slid back down the path, expecting at any moment to feel a cold hand on my ankle. I did not look back. But I felt their eyes on my retreating back, those 3 pairs of absolute black, drinking in my fear. Chapter 5. The Stair. The days that followed my visit to the Meldon cottage were a descent into a waking nightmare. The vicarage, once a damp but solid refuge, became a prison of echoing dread. The sounds intensified, the dragging steps, the wet bubbling, the sighs at the door. The smell of the mere, of peat and decay, permeated every room, no matter how many fires I lit. Worse, however, was the feeling of being watched. It was a constant, pricking sensation on the back of my neck, a certainty that from the shadows in the corner of a room or from the darkness beyond a window, those black eyes were fixed upon me. I took to drawing every curtain, but it was no use. The feeling persisted, an invisible pressure that began to erode my sanity. I took ill. A deep, racking cough seized my chest, and a profound lethargy weighed down my limbs. Mrs. Rigby brought me broth and tisanes, but her face was grim, her manner that of a nurse tending a terminal patient. "It's the damp, Reverend," she would say, but her eyes told another story. She knew. One evening, fevered and unable to sleep, I went to my study for a book. The fire had burned low, and the room was thick with shadows. I froze on the threshold. There, standing before the hearth, was one of them, a little girl, in a clean, dry pinafore. Her back was to me. She was perfectly still. The world seemed to shrink to that single, dreadful figure. I could not speak, could not cry out. I could only stand and wait. Slowly, with a terrible, unnatural grace, she began to turn. First her profile, then her full face came into view. Those eyes. The blackness was absolute, a void that promised nothing, felt nothing, needed nothing. It was a hunger that was not a hunger, a cold that was beyond temperature. She raised one pale hand and pointed, not at me, but at the chair behind my desk. The message was clear. I was to sit. I was to be still. I was to be seen. Paralyzed by a terror so complete it felt like awe, I obeyed. I shuffled to the chair and sat, my hands gripping the worn arms. And she watched me. It was not a mere glance or a stare. It was a consumption. I felt something leaching out of me under that gaze. Not my health, not yet, but something finer. My hope. My faith. The memory of sunlight on a summer's day. The comfort of a well-remembered verse of poetry. The love I had once held for my fellow man. These things were drawn out of me like vapor, siphoned away into those depthless black pools. I was being unmade, not with violence, but with a patient, terrible indifference. I was a rock being worn smooth by the constant, gentle lap of stagnant water. I do not know how long I sat there. It could have been minutes, it could have been hours. Time had no meaning under that gaze. When I finally managed to blink, to break the terrible connection, she was gone. Only the faint smell of peat and the crushing weight of my own despair remained. I knew then what had happened to Mr. Withers. He had not fled. He had been emptied. He had been seen until there was nothing left of him to see, and then the mere had likely taken his hollow shell. I was not myself. I was a vessel rapidly filling with despair. My sermons became rambling, bleak discourses on the silence of God and the futility of prayer. My congregation dwindled to a handful of the most stubborn or curious. They would watch me with a kind of horrified fascination, seeing the change in me, recognizing the marks of the stare. I took to walking the churchyard at night, a shambling, spectral figure in my own right. I would stop before the graves of those who had died young, the stillborn infants, the children taken by fever. I found myself envying them their clean, Christian rest. I began to understand the whispers about the Meldon children. They were not alive, not as we understand it. They were things wearing the shapes of the drowned, sent back to walk amongst the living, to drain the warmth and the will from the world. One night, standing by the mere, looking into its black, reflective surface, I felt a pull. A seductive invitation to let go, to step in, to end the terrible emptiness. The water looked peaceful. It promised an end to the feeling of being constantly watched, constantly drained. It was only the distant sound of a bell, perhaps from a stray sheep, that broke the trance. I stumbled back from the edge, weeping with a terror that was now mingled with a shameful longing. Chapter 6. The Reckoning. The final act of my tragedy began on a night of howling wind and lashing rain. The storm was a physical manifestation of the turmoil within my own soul. The vicarage groaned and shook, and the sounds within its walls were no longer subtle. They were crashes and thuds, as if something were moving through the rooms, dragging a heavy, wet burden. I was in my study, a Bible open on my desk, though the words swam before my eyes, meaningless scratches on a page. The lamp flickered, and the shadows leaped and danced like demons. I knew I could not endure another night. I was a hair's breadth from succumbing completely, from walking out into the mere and offering myself to the black water. Then I saw them. Not just one. All three. They stood in the doorway to the study, side by side. Their clothes were dry, despite the tempest outside. Water dripped from their hair and pooled at their feet, but the garments themselves were untouched. Their black eyes were fixed on me. This was it. The final seeing. They had come to finish what they had started. A strange, final anger surged within me. A last spark of the man I had been. I would not go quietly into that void. If this was a thing of spirit, I would fight it with spirit. I slammed the Bible shut and stood, my voice a ragged croak. In the name of Jesus Christ, I command you to leave this place. The words fell into the silence like stones into a deep well. There was no reaction, no flinching, no anger. Only the same flat, implacable staring. The void did not recognize the name. My faith, my ultimate weapon, was useless against this ancient, pre-Christian emptiness. One of them, the smallest, a boy, took a step forward. Then another. They began to advance into the room, slowly, in unison. I backed away, my courage evaporating, replaced by raw, primal fear. I stumbled against the bookshelf, my hand closing around the only object within reach, the heavy brass crucifix that had belonged to Mr. Withers. I thrust it out before me like a shield. Back! I command you back! The children stopped. For the first time, something changed. They did not look at the cross, nor at me. They tilted their heads, as if listening to a distant sound. Then, slowly they turned their black gaze towards the window. The storm raged outside. A fork of lightning lit up the night, and in its brief, blinding glare, I saw a figure standing in the vicarage garden, silhouetted against the fury of the elements. It was tall and gaunt. Old Tam Meldon. He stood motionless, his arms at his sides, facing the house. He was not there to help me. He was there to observe, to oversee the culmination of his dreadful bargain. The distraction was enough. With a cry that was part sob, part scream, I threw the crucifix at the advancing children. It passed through the space where they stood and clattered against the far wall. They were not there. I was alone in the room. Gasping for breath, my mind unraveling, I ran to the window. Old Tam was gone. The garden was empty. I do not remember the rest of that night. I must have collapsed, for I was found the next morning by Mrs. Rigby, lying on the study floor, feverish and raving. I was insensible for a week, drifting in and out of nightmares filled with black water and blacker eyes. When I finally regained a semblance of coherence, my first sight was of the bishop, sitting by my bedside, his face a mask of grave concern. "Cuthbert, my dear fellow," he said, "you've been terribly ill. The marsh fever. It addles the brain. Mrs. Rigby has been telling me of your fancies." I tried to sit up, to tell him it was no fancy, that the danger was real and present. But the words would not come. The experience had been too profound, too alien, to be conveyed in human language. I would sound like a madman. I saw the rational disbelief in his eyes, the readiness to attribute it all to miasma and a nervous disposition. He patted my hand. "We shall move you to Ipswich. A change of air is what you need. This parish, it is clearly too much for any man. We will find another incumbent. A stronger one." The thought of another man coming to this place, falling under the same terrible gaze, filled me with a fresh horror. But I was broken. I had no fight left. I merely nodded and turned my face to the wall. Epilogue. The return to the world. I write this now from a small, sunny room in a quiet clergy house in Ipswich. The windows look out onto a tidy garden where bees hum amongst the roses. It is a picture of pastoral tranquility. My health, by all outward measures, has returned. I take my meals, I perform my light duties, I converse politely with my fellows. But I am not healed. I am a shell. The things that made me who I was, my faith, my curiosity, my capacity for joy and wonder, were scooped out of me in that study in Blackmere. I feel nothing but a vast, hollow quiet where my soul used to be. I am like a book whose text has been washed away by flood, leaving only the blank parchment behind. I make inquiries, when I can, of anyone who might have news of Blackmere. The stories are few and contradictory. Some say the village was abandoned after a particularly bad flood the year after I left. Others say a fire swept through it, cleansing the old timber and thatch. A traveling merchant once told me he passed that way and found nothing but a placid expanse of water where the village green had been, as if the mere had finally claimed its own. And of the Meldons? There is no word, no trace. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I start from my sleep, convinced I hear the sound of dripping water. I will rush to the window, my heart pounding, and look out into the street. And on occasion I see them, or I think I do. A group of children, standing under the gaslight, their faces pale smudges in the gloom. They are always too far away to see their eyes clearly. They never move. They simply stand and watch. I do not know if they are real, or phantoms conjured by my broken mind. I do not know if the horror of Blackmere was a singular evil, confined to that cursed patch of fun, or if the things that sleep in the deep mud merely bided their time, and have now sent their watchers out into the wider world. I only know that I was seen, and that wherever I go, I carry the chill of the mere inside me, and the terrible fear that one night, I will look out into the darkness and see, shining back at me, two perfect voids of absolute blackness. Editor's note. The preceding account ends here. No further record of the Reverend Alban Cuthbert exists. A search of clerical directories shows a man of that name held a minor post in Ipswich until 1845, after which he vanishes from all records. The village of Blackmere does not appear on any standard ordnance survey maps of Suffolk, though a region known as the Blackmere Fens is noted for being particularly treacherous and largely uninhabited. Whether the Reverend's tale is a genuine chronicle of events, the elaborate delusion of a fever-stricken mind, or something else entirely, is left for the reader to decide. Some truths, perhaps, are too dark to be looked at directly.